It's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Stan Grant. The program, if you look at the program, it says a presentation by Stan Grant. Now, so I'm going to have to leave it to him to see what the presentation is. Many of you would know of Stan as a journalist, as a very significant commentator who's made a huge contribution to our journalistic endeavour in Australia. Stan has just been appointed as Professor of Global Affairs at Griffith University, so in a way, you know, we invited him as a journalist, we have him now as a professor. I leave as one of you. And he leaves as one of us. So with no further ado, Stan Grant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can I just pay my respects, first of all, to the traditional people of this land, of whom I share connections. Many of my family are, in fact, both Wiradjuri people and Ngunnawal people, so I do feel as if I'm back on my own country. It's lovely to be here. There's a real confluence of events this week. I was down to give this address at the same time as I was asked to give the annual Hawke Lecture in Adelaide on Friday. And they really cut across similar issues. The Hawke Lecture, they wanted me to talk about the Uluru Statement and what that means for Australia. And I really started to think about the span of my journalistic career. I came into journalism with the election of Bob Hawke, and I leave journalism with Donald Trump in the White House. My years span Hawke to Trump. It goes from the age of consensus to the age of anger. Ronald Reagan was President of the United States in my teenage years. We've gone from mourning in America to American carnage. And I really wanted to talk about that journey and the journey that I've taken as a journalist and what I've seen and what I've taken away from that period. It's often said that journalism is a front row seat at history. And that is true, and certainly been true in my case. Well, I'd have to add that journalists do not make the best historians, far too prone to drama and short attention span and much more interested in events than ideas. But I've been very lucky to have seen the world change around me. I suppose I came of age as a journalist in that sort of late 80s period with the end of the Cold War and a flourishing of democracy throughout the world. The mid-20th century was a boom time for democracy. It went from just over 30 democratic states in the early 70s to over 110 by the early 2000s. But what have we seen during that period? Remember Francis Fukuyama and that end of history quote, that this was the end of the great ideological battles, that liberal democracy was the last ideology left standing in the ring. Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singaporean ambassador and political scientist, has said that Fukuyama's comment about the end of history, in his words, did a lot of brain damage to the West. Joseph Nye, who coined that phrase soft power, wrote about the concerns that he saw, the assumptions of the future of liberal democracy, what he saw as a complacency. And he said that the United States and the West, at the time of their greatest triumph, had taken their eye off the ball. That the assumption that the world would simply give way to liberal democratic ideas, that we would enter an era of open borders and free trade, and that would be good for all of us. That the idea that people may cling to what was seen as archaic identities was over. That we were now all individuals, or as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. What have we seen since Francis Fukuyama's end of history? I'd argue that we've seen the return of history. That's certainly what I've seen as a reporter. Look around our world right now and what do we see? We see a resurgence of populism, authoritarianism, nationalism, tribalism, sectarianism. The borders are now going back up. There is a blowback against immigration that is fueling the rise of the political right across Europe. We know that it lies significantly at the heart of the Brexit vote, and the immigration was a key to Donald Trump winning the White House. This is the age of anger. That's what Pankaj Mishra, the Indian writer, has called it, the age of anger. I think also that it's the age of identity. I've been thinking a lot about this question of identity, of what does it mean to define yourself in this age. Francis Fukuyama has returned to that subject himself in a recent book where he talks about the idea of themos. What he says is the Greek word for respect or recognition. Themos, that part of our soul that desires recognition and respect. Kwame Anthony Appiah, the cosmopolitan thinker and writer, also has a book out on identity that he's called The Lies That Bind. The Lies That Bind. That identity is a construction. It is a lie. But it is a lie within which we invest so much of ourselves. Amartya Sen, the Indian economist and philosopher, wrote about this, and he called it the dangers of solitarist identities. Solitarist identities that define ourselves in exclusive terms, us and them, that pit ourselves against each other. If I tick off the conflicts that I've reported on throughout my career, identity lies at the heart of all of them. Hutu versus Tutsi in Rwanda. Catholic versus Protestant in Ireland. The blood feud of Sunni and Shia Islam. Hindu versus Muslim. The existential nuclear-armed standoff between India and Pakistan. North and South Korea. When Amartya Sen says that identities can kill, we know that all too well, because that's what we've seen in our world. What we've seen as well is the playing out of what Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, called the politics of difference, the ideal of authenticity. No longer is it recognition of your rights as an individual, but he says recognition of your right to survive. This was a battle. It was no longer about liberating the individual, but the very survival of your particular group. And it's come at a time when we are seeing challenges to democracy around our world, a democratic recession, as some people have called it. When you tie recognition together with identity, it requires a story. And the story that I've seen in my time is a story that is rooted in the grievance of history. The grievance of history. Something that Friedrich Nietzsche once called a malignant historical fever. Just think about the stories we tell ourselves in the world today. I reported for a decade out of China from Beijing with CNN. I saw the rise of Xi Jinping and how he flicked the switch to this virulent strain of Chinese nationalism and the constant refrain of the 100 years of humiliation. The 100 years of humiliation of China by foreign powers stretching back to the Opium War up until Mao's revolution. Think about Vladimir Putin. When he talks about the end of the Soviet Union being the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, when you consider what a bloody century it was, he considers that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Recep Tayyip Erdogan laments the end of the Ottoman Empire. ISIS spoke about a return of the caliphate. We have people defining themselves within the framework of an unrelenting, unending sense of historical grievance. Think of Donald Trump and his pledge to make America great again. That things were better in some imagined past, what Mark Liller, the American political scientist, has called a militant nostalgia. He spoke of the shipwrecked mind. He said the shipwrecked mind is the mind of the radical Islamist, of the alt-right, of all of those people who see the future, the debris of the future passing by them, who can't imagine a future that is not built around their idea of historical grievance. Identity, historical grievance, a return to tribalism is what we see at the heart of our world today. It is the challenge to democracy at a very time when the continued resurgence of China is offering up a viable alternative to a liberal democratic order. An authoritarian alternative that has continued to make its people rich, that has continued to liberalise its economy while rejecting the tenets of political liberalism. This is the crosshairs that we face in our history right now. And I've gone looking for those people who would best explain this world to us. Journalists don't explain this world to us. Politicians seek to exploit this world, and economists certainly don't explain this phenomena, this cultural need for tribalism and identity, this rejection of the tenets of globalisation and universalism. And I've gone back to Carl Schmitt, the German political writer and philosopher, and the way that he saw democracy essentially as being a battle not between adversaries, but between friends and enemies. We don't disagree with someone, we reject them. Someone is no longer wrong, they are evil. This is the language that we hear so often in our politics today. Chantal Mouffe, the English political philosopher, has written about this idea. She picked up on Carl Schmitt's idea of this need for a permanent enemy, and she wondered why we were seeing this blowback against globalisation, which had made us wealthier, had increased our connectivity to each other, had seen enormous breakthroughs in technology that had underpinned China's ability to lift more than 500 million people out of poverty. Why were we seeing this blowback? And she went back to that period at the end of the Cold War and that idea of the end of history. When we heard politicians like Tony Blair coin phrases like the third way, or Bill Clinton and his political ideas of triangulation, that they would take as accepted the precepts of neoliberalism, take in Blair's case the fundamentals of Margaret Thatcher's economic model, and overlay that with an ethical and moral politics that spoke to progressive causes and progressive issues. But Chantal Mouffe says that those people who pursued the third way and triangulation, this pursuit of the much lauded political centre, were chasing a mirage. Worse than that, it was a siren song that lured democracy onto the rocks. Consensus, she said, did not create a more reconciled society. Instead, it fueled antagonism. The unquestioned belief in liberal democracy banished all forms of political resistance or opposition to the fringes. Economics, ethics, morality, all, in her view, crowded out politics. But politics cannot be contained. To the liberals, humanity was too rational for tribalism. We had freed ourselves from archaic bonds of class, race, or religion. But Chantal Mouffe tells us that they were wrong. As she wrote, the mistake of liberal rationalism is to ignore the effective dimension mobilised by collective identifications and to imagine that those supposedly archaic passions are bound to disappear with the advance of individualism and the progress of rationality. She said that we had elevated policy over identity. We had elevated policy over identity. If I look around the world today, what do we see? We see a white, unemployed steel worker from Wisconsin who may previously have voted for Barack Obama, now throwing his lot in with Donald Trump. Because Hillary Clinton, one of the progressive liberals that Chantal Mouffe would have identified, dismissed them as belonging to a basket of deplorables. We look at the UK and we see people pushing back against immigration and voting to exit the European Union. People whose politics were pushed to the fringes, who were told that no longer did they have a voice, that no one spoke for them, that the ideas of collective identities were banished to the past, that if they lost their job because their factory closed down, all they needed to do was to retrain, were now coming roaring back. That's what we're seeing in our democracies right now. We see it in Australia. A third of the people, of voters, not voting for either of the major parties. The Wentworth by-election recently, neither of the major parties managed to secure 50%. We see it with the rise of groups like One Nation. We see it with the increasing volatility in our parliaments, increasing numbers of independents on the crossbenches in the Senate and in the House, to the point where politics is no longer decided by the 80%. We don't govern from the 80%. The governing is dictated by the 20% and growing on the fringes. Those who were told that they didn't have a voice in the political centre, who are now roaring back. John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States and its second president, once said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, murders itself. There never was a democracy that did not commit suicide." Is that what we're seeing now? That this democracy that has not even yet, in historical terms, reached middle age, is now waning and potentially on its knees. This is the challenge of our age. Whether democracy is fit for purpose in a world where nation states are not so clearly defined, where the borders are not so clearly defined, where we are no longer homogenous states but increasingly pluralist and diverse states with different groups contending for political recognition and power and eroding an overall sense of civic nationalism. Can democracy survive that within its boundaries, at the same time meet the challenge of an increasing authoritarianism led by a China that does not intend adopting liberal democratic principles? That's the question of our age. I wanted to bring that to Australia and to look, each country meets these challenges in different ways, depending on their historical circumstances. What is the challenge in Australia? What is the unresolved question at the heart of our democracy? The very question of the legitimacy of the Australian state. The idea that a country can be taken from a people who had lived here for tens of thousands of years on the basis that this was terra nullius, that it was an empty land and the people had no rights to that land. The idea that a constitution would be formulated at the time of federation that stated explicitly that Aboriginal natives will not be counted when reckoning the numbers of the Commonwealth. It has been an ongoing struggle for Australia to be able to rationalise the principles of its democracy, one of the oldest and profound modern democracies in the world, with the ongoing exclusion, something that the anthropologist Bill Stanner called the torment of powerlessness that Indigenous people in Australia still face. Just like other parts of the world, we also emptied out the political centre from adversarial politics. In the 1990s, after the Mabo High Court decision which struck down terra nullius, we stopped talking about rights and we started increasingly to talk about reconciliation. Ideas such as a treaty were banished to the political fringes. The emphasis was on getting a job, getting an education, saying sorry. The emphasis was on improving the lot of Aboriginal people, closing the gap, but we stopped talking about politics. At a time when there are more Aboriginal people graduating university than ever before, hopefully that's not mine. That is. At a time when there are more Aboriginal people graduating universities than ever before, when there is a burgeoning Aboriginal middle class, when my grandfather would look at my life, someone, in my case, who was born in an Aboriginal mission in rural New South Wales, who has grown up to travel the world as a reporter, to stand in the White House with Barack Obama, to stand in the Great Hall of the People to see Xi Jinping anointed as the new leader of China, to have stood outside Osama bin Laden's house in Pakistan the night after he was killed, to have seen the things that I've seen. My grandfather would look at my life and it would be utterly unrecognisable. Why at a time when we are seeing, yes, still great challenges, but increasing success among individual Aboriginal people, are we also seeing an increasing anger? Last Australia Day was an angrier Australia Day than I can imagine. Why are Aboriginal people screaming in the faces of white Australians celebrating Australia Day that they want to see this country burn to the ground? I would argue, precisely as Chantal Mouffe has argued, that we emptied out the centre from politics. We banished it to the fringes. We stopped talking about politics and we talked about economics, and we talked about morality, and we talked about ethics. But we banished the political, we banished the antagonism. How do we bring that antagonism back to the centre of politics and still allow our democracies to hold? How do we not push those voices to the fringes where they fester with resentment and give them a place within our political architecture so that they are heard, they feel as if they are recognised, and that they can accept the umpire's verdict when the national decision goes against them? How do we create a more capacious idea of democracy that doesn't tell these people that their beliefs are archaic and not at one with a modern political world? Aboriginal Australia is no different to what we're seeing in other parts of the world, where the rise of identity politics fuelled by anger, historical grievance, is really eating away at a sense of civic nationalism, eating away at the fundamentals of democracy. And yet at the height of that, we had the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I was really privileged and fortunate to be appointed by the Parliament. It was both it was a cross-parliamentary body appointed to the Referendum Council. It was our job to travel Australia to speak to Aboriginal groups about how they wish to be recognised in Australia. A group of people who had been locked out and excluded, for whom democracy was never meant for them, were increasingly telling us that they saw a place within this democracy that could meet their needs, that could fulfil the promise of this country and complete the democratic ideal of this country. The Uluru Statement suggested many things. One, that there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission so that the story of Australia, the history of Australia, could be heard. That there be a makarata, a Yolngu word from Arnhem Land, speaking of a coming together after a fight, a peacemaking. And that there be a constitutionally enshrined body that would give voice to the aspirations of Indigenous people. That body would be included in a constitution written to exclude Aboriginal people, that would give Indigenous people in Australia a voice in policy made toward them. Now, immediately you had people saying, well, that's a third chamber of the Parliament, and why should there be special laws for some and not for others? The reality is there are special laws for some and not for others. The reality is the highest court in this land has said that native title exists. And from native title there are a cascade of rights and issues and challenges that we need to resolve. The fact of the matter is, after the 1967 referendum, the Australian Parliament has the capacity to make laws specifically for Aboriginal people. As we saw with the intervention in the Northern Territory, the Racial Discrimination Act can be set aside so that laws can be made specifically for Aboriginal people. And yet 3% of the population, still suffering the torment of powerlessness, without the ability to move politics at the ballot box, have no effective representation. What a remarkable document the Uluru Statement is. A remarkable document that at a time when democracy is being challenged, when identity politics is undermining a sense of civic nationalism, at a time when we are seeing a resurgence of authoritarianism, that here were a group of people who had travelled the farthest distance and carried the heaviest load, saying that they believed in democracy enough that it could meet their aspirations and that they could complete the idea of Australia. Galarrwuy Yunupingu has described it as a gift. It is not just a gift to Australia. At a time when democracy is in retreat, it is a fundamental gift to democracies everywhere. You know, I just want to finish with going back to someone who I think probably encapsulates this age more than any other. That is the French-Algerian writer Albert Camus. And he looked at the world around him and he saw absurdity. He said, a world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels alien, a stranger. That someone in America could look to Donald Trump and say, he is the answer. Explain his world even with bad reasons. Makes sense to someone who feels alien, a stranger. Camus said, the divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. The absurd becomes God. That inability to understand becomes the existence that illuminates everything. Thank you.
Well, we've had the presentation, now some questions. We've got a few minutes for questions, so who would like to start?
This could not be a bashful room, I'm sure. Would you accept that from your students? Yep, I doubt it.
Let's start at the back here.
Thank you. Thank you, that was fantastic. My name is Michael. I'm a social psychologist here at the ANU. There was a point in your talk where I was getting the impression that you were portraying collective identities in a somewhat negative sense. And yet you brought it back to the power of a collective identity. And I just kind of wanted to ask you if you can clarify. I mean, for me, collective identities are things that can lead to negative, bad things, like you pointed out, but they also build nations,
and that's
build roads. So I just wait if you can.
That's precisely the answer. How we frame these collective identities. You know, if I look at my own life, I'm an Aboriginal person, Wiradjuri father, Gamilaroi mother. I'm also someone who's descended from an Irish convict. I am on the ship and on the shore. I'm all of those things. I'm a cosmopolitan. I'm someone who has lived a life in the world. But I'm rooted in a sense of belonging to this country and rooted in a sense of culture. You know, Kwame Anthony Appiah said, identity can shape the contours of your life or it can shut down your life. My identity shapes the contours of my life. I think when identity, as Charles Taylor has identified, stops being the recognition of the rights of the individual and how the individuals have free association, can form various collective groups, to the recognition of survival, to the recognition of the group, to what he called this recognition of authenticity, it changes shape. I think if we look around our world today, collective identities are increasingly being framed around historical grievance, us and them, tribalism, Democrat, Republican, you know, good and evil. That's the risk we face when we fail to walk that fine line between our fundamental individualism, our rights of free association, the hybrid and multi-layered aspects of all of our identities, and the hardened, exclusive, solitarist identity that pits one against another. That's the distinction I would make. And I think when you come to Australia, and I had to wrestle with this idea myself, as someone who fundamentally believes in individualism, who fundamentally believes that democracy is about the rights of the individual, to look at something like the Uluru Statement, which was an acknowledgement of the fundamental rights of a group within that democracy, was a hurdle. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. But I arrived at this point where I said, it is clear that as a group, we have been treated differently. My parents, my grandparents, my life was shaped differently because we were treated as a group. The capacity to animate the individuals within that group lies in the democracy's ability to be able to speak to the aspirations and demands of that constituent group. That by acknowledging the rights of Aboriginal people within a constitution that had excluded them, you tap into the potential of the individual Aboriginal people within that group to express their lives in whichever way they wish. Individualism can be married to the idea of group rights if we have a big enough idea of the capacity of our democracy. And I think that negates the idea then of a solitarist, adversarial, hate-filled, historical grievance-based identity by bringing it into the centre of a democracy that is a conflictual centre. A conflictual, rather than consensus, we look at adversarial models of politics that gives voice to that sense of grievance without pushing it to the fringes. That's what democracy needs to look at. And clearly we have not done that well in the 30 years since the end of the Cold War.
One last question.
That was a wonderful talk, very inspiring, very depressing. As a
I've lived a depressing life.
Yes, indeed, but challenging at the same time. As a psychiatrist, Uni Melbourne, I caught lots of psychological constructs, torment, tragedy, loss. I've circled all the words, respect, humiliation, one of the biggest words in our field, psychiatry. So what do we do about all these sentiments, these feelings? And the best thing that's happened to a number of us, including myself, is grassroots activism. And of course, in this country, that means get up. So I'm proud to get up as a member and to be fairly active, whether it's phoning around the populace to sway them and how to consider the election, etc. And you know, a whole range of activities which are all about progressive society formation. Not so much political, in my view, but the progressiveness of our society. And I just wondered what you thought about, not it, but about grassroots activism.
Yeah, I mean, it can be cathartic. And we see, when you see organisations that are, you know, that are very organic and that they have a broad-based structure, that they are organisations that speak broadly to our sense of place in the country and our demands on our democracy. I think those things can be very cathartic. I mean, look at the movement in the mid-60s in Australia, at a time when my father was being sent to jail for offensive language, having the crap beaten out of him in police cells. That an organisation, a grassroots movement of black people, white people, all other people in Australia, led to the most successful referendum in the history of Australia, the 1967 referendum. the most successful referendum in Australian history because of a grassroots political movement that was not defined around strict definitions, exclusive definitions of identity. I think that what we have seen, and again it comes back to the idea that Chantal Mouffe put forward, this idea that we neutralise politics at the centre, that we elevated economics or ethics or morality, that we saw these collective groups as being archaic, that it was the individual first, pushed a lot of these groups to the fringes. And it negated the capacity for these groups to form free association across a whole range of different ethnicities, religions, races, whatever. And I think what we see now is a hardening of politics, so that even if you see grassroots movements, there will often be a toxic identity overlain in those groups. And I think that can be really, really dangerous. And that's why I went to that point before. There is a psychological aspect to it. The psychological aspect of loss and grievance and vengeance. You know, what Nietzsche called ressentiment. Not resentment where you harbour a grievance, but an unquenchable vengeance that frames your very identity because people have been pushed out of the centre. And I think the type of grassroots movement you're talking about, these large cathartic groups of people drawn from all different aspects of society are incredibly healthy things. But I think we are really starting to see the dangers right now in the opposite of that, which is political mobilisation around strict identitarian groups that are exclusive and harbour resentment at the core. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, there's no more time for questions. There's so many issues that we could raise, and we don't have the time, unfortunately, but I'd like you all to join with me in thanking Stan for a wonderful presentation.